Normandy, 1944. In the hedgerows, a Sherman tank moves forward with the deliberate confidence of a machine built to advance. Its engine is steady. Its crew is alert, trained to expect the impact of steel on steel. When the German round strikes, it is only one hit. Sharp, concussive, violent, but not immediately fatal. The armor is pierced. The shock travels through the hull. For a fraction of a second, survival still seems possible. Then the fire arrives. It does not creep. It does not hesitate. It races through the fighting compartment with unnatural speed, filling the confined space with heat and light before the crew can react. What should have been a wound becomes a sentence. Flames leap from panel to panel, fed not by fuel alone, but by something far more dangerous stored within arm's reach. Inside the hull, the ammunition begins to cook off. One round ignites, then another, each detonation feeding the next in a brutal chain reaction. The tank becomes a furnace, its interior transformed from armored shelter into sealed combustion chamber. The penetration itself has spared the crew. The aftermath will not. Escape is measured in seconds. Hatches jam under deformation. Vision blocks shatter. Smoke blinds and chokes. Men who survive the impact find their exits erased by heat and pressure. Training dissolves into instinct. Some crews claw their way out. Many do not. Those who hesitate are simply overtaken. Among American tankers, a grim understanding takes hold. Armor can fail. That is expected. But fire is different. Fire leaves no margin. It does not wound. It consumes. Crews begin to fear ignition more than penetration, heat more than shrapnel. The threat is no longer just the enemy gunner beyond the hedgerow, but the invisible danger packed tightly around their knees and ankles. Quietly, without any official sanction, a name spreads from crew to crew. It is not written in manuals or painted on hulls. It is spoken low, usually after dark. The Sherman, they say, burns like a cigarette lighter. One strike, and it lights. They call it the Ronson. No engineer intended this. No doctrine predicted it. Yet, in the fields of Normandy, the pattern repeats often enough to feel inevitable. The crews sense it before the reports confirm it. Something inside the tank is making survival less likely than it should be. And somewhere far from the front, buried in paperwork and assumptions, that realization is about to collide with evidence that cannot be ignored. By the summer of 1944, veteran Sherman crews no longer spoke of fire as a possibility. They spoke of it as an expectation. Men who had survived their first engagements learned quickly that being hit was not the end of the story. The end came later, measured not in penetration depth, but in seconds until ignition. Among tankers, this knowledge passed quietly, learned through observation rather than instruction. What killed crews, they understood, was not the initial impact. A clean penetration could leave a man unhurt, still conscious, still capable of movement. But survival depended on what followed. If the interior stayed dark and silent, escape was possible. If it bloomed into flame, it was not. Ignition, not armor failure, became the true dividing line between life and death. Inside the Sherman, ammunition placement turned into fatal knowledge. Rounds were stacked along the hull walls and floor, accessible, efficient, and dangerously exposed. Crews knew where every shell sat, not from diagrams, but from habit. When a hit landed near those racks, they braced for the next sound, the one that mattered more than the first. Many hits that should have wounded instead incinerated. A shell that merely punched through armor became lethal only when it touched propellant. Fire spread faster than training assumed. Smoke filled lungs before orders could be shouted. Men who survived the physics of impact were defeated by chemistry. German gunners learned this pattern as well. They did not need perfect shots. They aimed low, toward the hull sides, where ammunition lived. A single penetration, placed correctly, was often enough. It was efficient, repeatable, and devastating, not because the Sherman was weak, but because it was vulnerable in the wrong place. For crews inside, survival began to feel arbitrary. Two tanks could be hit the same way. One crew escaped, the other vanished. Courage mattered less than chance. Skill mattered less than where the shell landed. This randomness eroded confidence more effectively than any battlefield defeat. Slowly, an unspoken conclusion formed among the men who fought inside the steel boxes. The enemy was dangerous, but something inside the tank was accelerating death. Until that hidden factor was understood, every hit carried the same quiet expectation. And far from the hedgerows, a small group of engineers was beginning to ask the same question: why some penetrations burned, and others did not. Inside the Sherman's steel hull, ammunition was stored the way engineers had always stored it. Dry, stacked, and immediately accessible. Shells lined the fighting compartment, arranged for speed and efficiency. In theory, this meant faster loading, sustained fire, and battlefield momentum. In practice, it placed volatile propellant inches from crewmen's legs, separated from catastrophe by nothing more than thin metal racks. When penetrated, that propellant did not burn slowly. It ignited violently. The flash was instantaneous, the pressure overwhelming. What began as a breach in armor escalated into something far more destructive. Flames leapt from one exposed round to the next, creating a chain reaction that no human reflex could outrun. The tank's interior, designed as a workspace, became a firestorm. Armor failure alone did not doom the crew, but armor failure followed by ignition almost always did. Heat spread faster than command could travel. Smoke erased visibility. The confined space magnified every effect. A single penetration cascaded into total internal collapse, not because the tank had been defeated, but because its contents had turned against it. Crew drills reflected this reality, even if no one officially acknowledged it. Training emphasized speed. Bail out fast. Move immediately. Do not hesitate. Survival was measured in seconds, not in containment or recovery. There was no procedure for fighting the fire because there was no expectation of winning against it. Once ignition began, the tank was considered lost. After-action reports began to repeat the same pattern with unsettling consistency. Penetration, fire, fatalities. Different units, different terrain, same outcome. The enemy weapon varied, but the result did not. Patterns emerged that could not be dismissed as bad luck or poor handling. Something systemic was at work. Slowly, engineers and ordnance analysts began to separate cause from coincidence. They compared burned-out hulls to those that did not ignite. They mapped where shells were stored and where hits landed. The conclusion formed reluctantly but clearly. The Sherman was not merely vulnerable to fire. In too many cases, the tank itself was killing its own crew. And once that truth surfaced, the question was no longer whether the design could be improved, but how much longer the war would allow it to remain unchanged. The Sherman was not born on the battlefield. It was born on drafting tables, in factories, and in conference rooms where the future of armored warfare was discussed in abstractions. From the beginning, it was designed to be built quickly, in vast numbers, by an industrial system that prized consistency over perfection. Speed of production was not a secondary goal. It was the foundation of the entire design philosophy. American planners believed that reliability would win wars faster than invincibility. A tank that ran every day, crossed long distances, and could be repaired easily mattered more than one that survived every hit. The Sherman reflected that belief. Its engine was dependable. Its parts were standardized. Its mechanical failures were few. In a world where logistics decided campaigns, these traits were seen as decisive advantages. Ammunition access followed the same logic. Rounds needed to be reached quickly, loaded smoothly, and replenished under stress. Storing shells close at hand made sense on paper. Isolation added complexity. Complexity slowed production. In peacetime tests, it worked. The gun fired. The crew functioned. No one watched the tank burn. Early doctrine also shaped expectations. American armored theory assumed mobility, combined arms, and maneuver not static duels with high-velocity anti-tank guns. Penetrations were expected to be occasional, not routine. Tanks were meant to fight other targets while infantry and artillery suppressed enemy guns. Under those assumptions, internal survivability seemed less urgent. Crew loss, while acknowledged, was not fully anticipated. Designers did not imagine repeated penetrations under combat conditions that forced crews to remain inside burning vehicles. Casualty estimates existed, but they were abstract numbers without faces. The difference between a disabled tank and a dead crew was not yet central to design conversations. Pre-war testing reinforced this confidence. Trials were controlled, ammunition was inert or limited, hits were theoretical or clean. Tanks were evaluated for performance, not for what happened when everything went wrong at once. Fire behaved politely in test environments. War would not. None of this came from malice or neglect. The Sherman was a rational answer to the questions planners believed they were asking. It was a tank built for an army that valued momentum, logistics, and speed. Every choice had logic behind it. Every compromise seemed acceptable. But combat does not respect assumptions. In Normandy's hedgerows and Europe's narrow roads, the Sherman met a battlefield its designers had not fully imagined. Penetrations were frequent, enemy gunners were patient. Ammunition did not remain theoretical. The design still made sense, just not in the way its creators intended. And as evidence mounted from burned-out hulls and silent crews, the distance between belief and reality became impossible to ignore. Somewhere between the factory floor and the front line, the war was demanding a reckoning. For the men inside the Sherman, theory ended the moment steel was struck by fire. Crews experienced the consequences of design choices not as diagrams or reports, but as heat, smoke, and seconds slipping away. What had been calculated as acceptable risk on paper became a lived reality measured in scars and empty seats. The tank did not fail politely. It failed violently, and it failed where crews lived. Among tankers, burn rates became informal statistics. Units remembered which platoons lost men to fire and which did not. Stories replaced data tables. A crewman did not need a report to know the odds. He had watched another tank vanish in flame after a single hit. The knowledge spread the way battlefield truths always do, through observation, repetition, and loss. In response, crews began to alter their machines without permission. Ammunition stowage was modified quietly, sometimes crudely. Shells were moved, spaced, or removed altogether, reducing firepower in exchange for a chance at survival. These changes violated regulations, but survival had a way of outranking doctrine. No officer had to order it. Fear was instruction enough. Improvisation followed necessity. Extra water cans were wedged wherever space allowed. Sandbags appeared inside hulls, added not for armor, but for fire suppression. None of it was tested. None of it was standardized. It was an act of desperation born from repeated observation. Anything that slowed flame, even briefly, mattered. Fear altered behavior under fire in subtle but profound ways. Crews hesitated before advancing into exposed ground. They avoided positions that forced them to take hits from the side. Gunners fired faster, sometimes less accurately, knowing that prolonged engagement increased the chance of ignition. Commanders weighed orders against an unspoken calculation how likely this tank was to burn. Official morale reports told a different story. They spoke of confidence, cohesion, and fighting spirit. What they rarely captured was the quiet erosion beneath the surface. Confidence did not vanish suddenly. It leaked away with every burned hull left behind, every crew replaced, every reminder that survival was uncertain even after doing everything right. The gap between designers and crews widened with each engagement. Engineers were refining production schedules. Crews were counting funerals. Lessons were being learned, but not in laboratories or proving grounds. They were being written in after-action reports, stained with smoke and grief. These lessons carried a brutal clarity. The problem was not bravery. It was not training. It was not the enemy alone. Something fundamental had to change, or the cost would continue to be paid by those least able to afford it. And slowly, beyond the front lines, those losses began to speak louder than assumptions ever had. Away from the front, in offices far quieter than the hedgerows, ordnance analysts began assembling the story the battlefield was telling. After-action reports arrived in stacks, typed summaries, handwritten notes, diagrams sketched from memory. Each described a tank struck, a crew lost, a vehicle destroyed. Individually, they seemed like the cost of war. Together, They formed a pattern that refused to stay hidden. Penetration alone did not explain the fatalities. Engineers compared vehicles knocked out without fire to those consumed instantly. The thickness of armor, the caliber of the incoming round, the angle of impact, none of it fully accounted for the difference. Something else was deciding outcomes after the armor failed. They began mapping ammunition ignition patterns with clinical precision, where shells were stored, where penetrations occurred, how quickly fires followed. Charts replaced anecdotes. Burned hulls were dissected like forensic scenes. Again and again, the same conclusion surfaced. When ammunition was struck or overheated, death followed with terrifying consistency. The efficiency of German gunners sharpened the contrast. Enemy anti-tank weapons were lethal, but not uniquely so. Other armies faced similar fire. Yet, American losses were disproportionately high once penetration occurred. The numbers were impossible to dismiss. The enemy was skilled, but American tanks were amplifying the damage. Data began to contradict long-held assumptions. Reliability did not prevent death. Accessibility did not equal survivability. The very features that made the Sherman easy to operate were accelerating crew loss once things went wrong. What had been considered acceptable risk was now measurable consequence. Reluctantly, blame shifted, not away from the enemy entirely, but inward. The gunner across the field pulled the trigger, but the tank itself determined whether the crew lived long enough to escape. This was not a failure of courage or discipline. It was a failure of internal design. The realization carried weight. Admitting it meant acknowledging that thousands of men had been placed inside machines that betrayed them under fire. It challenged production priorities, doctrine, and pride. But the evidence left little room for denial. From that reckoning emerged a radical idea, deceptively simple. If fire was killing crews, then fire had to be denied. If ammunition was the catalyst, then it had to be contained. Not with thicker armor or bigger guns, but with something almost mundane: water. The proposal was inelegant and unglamorous. Surround the ammunition with water, let physics do the rest. Drown the flames before they could spread. Slow the fire long enough for men to escape. On paper, it looked plausible. In practice, it would challenge everything the Sherman had been built to be. And now, the question was no longer whether the idea made sense, but whether the system was willing to change in time. The solution that emerged did not look like a breakthrough. It did not promise dominance or spectacle. It offered no increase in firepower and no dramatic leap in armor thickness. Instead, it proposed something quieter. Encase the Sherman's ammunition in water-jacketed bins, turning the tank's most dangerous vulnerability into something controllable. In the new design, shells were no longer stacked dry and exposed along the hull walls. They were sealed inside armored containers surrounded by a mixture of water and antifreeze. The principle was simple. When a penetrating round entered the hull, the liquid absorbed heat, slowed ignition, and suppressed flame before it could cascade. Fire would meet resistance not from crew action, but from physics itself. This marked a fundamental shift. Fire suppression became passive rather than reactive. Crews no longer had to recognize ignition, reach for extinguishers, or make impossible decisions under seconds of pressure. The tank began defending its crew automatically, buying time where none had existed before. Survival was no longer dependent on reflex alone. Tests confirmed what theory suggested. Propellant that once ignited instantly now burned slowly, or not at all. In many cases, penetrations produced smoke without flame. The violent chain reactions that had defined earlier losses were interrupted. The tank could still be knocked out, but it no longer became a furnace by default. Engineers went further. Ammunition storage was relocated lower in the hull, away from sidewalls and crew stations. This reduced the likelihood of direct hits on stored rounds and placed them behind additional layers of structure. The change altered internal layouts, complicated production, and required retraining. It was not elegant, but it worked. For the first time, penetration no longer guaranteed combustion. A hit could disable a vehicle without erasing its crew. That distinction mattered. It meant that a tank could be abandoned instead of cremated. It meant that men could climb out instead of vanishing. It meant the difference between replacement and survival. Survivability, once anecdotal, became measurable. Burn rates dropped sharply in test data. Time to escape increased. Casualty ratios shifted. These were not dramatic numbers meant for speeches. They were quiet improvements with profound implications. Each percentage point represented men who would not die screaming inside steel. Yet, the solution drew skepticism. It added weight, it complicated maintenance, it challenged the simplicity that had defined the Shermans' success. Some dismissed it as unnecessary caution. Others questioned whether such a mundane fix justified disruption at scale. After all, it did not make the tank stronger. It made it kinder. But war had already answered the question. The battlefield did not require invincibility. It required survivability. And Wet-Stowage delivered exactly that, without ceremony, without spectacle, without claiming more than it promised. The brilliance of the concept lay in its humility. It accepted that armor would fail. It accepted that tanks would be hit. Instead of denying these realities, it worked within them. It acknowledged the limits of steel and answered with restraint rather than bravado. What began as a technical adjustment carried moral weight. It recognized that saving crews mattered as much as destroying targets. That a tank's duty did not end when it was knocked out. That survival itself was a form of success. The idea was ready. The data was clear. But ideas do not move armies on their own. They still had to survive resistance. The problem with redesign in wartime is not engineering. It is momentum. By the time Wet-Stowage proved viable, the American tank industry was already moving at full speed. Production lines stretched across factories, optimized to produce Shermans in relentless numbers. Any change, even a life-saving one, threatened to slow the rhythm that planners believed was winning the war. Command feared delays more than losses. Tanks, they argued, were only useful if they arrived on time and in quantity. A tank delayed was a unit weakened somewhere else along the front. Crew casualties were tragic, but shortages were strategic. The arithmetic of war favored output over refinement, and production schedules carried more weight than burn statistics. Some officers went further. They argued that crews should adapt instead of machines. Better training, better tactics, better positioning. Fire, they said, was an occupational hazard. Tankers were not promised safety, only purpose. This logic was not cruel so much as inherited, drawn from decades of doctrine that treated men as consumable components of larger systems. The Wet-Stowage fix also suffered from a lack of drama. It did not add a new gun, it did not thicken armor plates or promise battlefield dominance. It did not change the silhouette of the tank or inspire confidence at a glance. It was invisible. A Sherman with Wet-Stowage looked like every other Sherman rolling off the line. That made it easy to delay and easier to dismiss. Bureaucracy did the rest. Committees reviewed data. Departments debated responsibility. Engineers argued feasibility while logisticians calculated costs. Each step added weeks. Each week added burned tanks at the front. The system was not designed to move quickly when the solution challenged its own priorities. Even when the numbers were clear, urgency lagged. Reports moved upward through layers of approval far removed from combat. The men deciding whether to act did not sit inside the tanks they discussed. Their war was measured in charts and schedules, not heat and smoke. The distance mattered. Meanwhile, crews continued to burn. The battlefield did not pause for redesign meetings. Shermans without Wet-Stowage kept advancing, kept taking hits, kept igniting in the same familiar way. Every delay translated directly into funerals, though no ledger recorded the connection explicitly. The resistance was not absolute, it was cautious, incremental, hesitant. Modifications were approved slowly. Some factories adapted, others waited. Priority went to new production rather than retrofitting older vehicles. The fix existed, but not yet at scale. This tension defined the moment. Innovation had identified the problem. Evidence had proven the solution. But belief still clung to old metrics of success. Speed, numbers, and firepower retained their primacy, even as crews paid the price for that hierarchy. History often treats technological change as inevitable. It rarely is. It must push through inertia, pride, and fear of disruption. Wet-Stowage faced all three. Not because it failed, but because it worked in a way that forced the system to confront its own blind spots. Eventually, the pressure became too great, the data too consistent, the losses too visible to ignore entirely. Change would come, but not all at once, and not without cost. And when the first modified tanks finally reached the front, they arrived without ceremony, carrying a quiet promise that only those inside would truly understand. The first Wet-Stowage Shermans did not arrive with announcements or demonstrations. They appeared quietly, mixed into replacement pools and new shipments, indistinguishable from the tanks they replaced. To most crews, they looked the same. Steel was steel. Armor was armor. Only the interior told a different story. And even that difference was easy to underestimate. Crews were skeptical, but they allowed themselves a measure of hope. They had heard promises before, new tactics, new procedures, small adjustments meant to improve odds that rarely did. Water around ammunition sounded almost naive. It did not feel like protection. It felt like an experiment carried out far from danger. Combat tested it immediately. The modified Shermans still took hits. German guns did not lose their accuracy. Penetrations still punched through hulls and turrets. The laws of ballistics had not changed. What changed was what followed. Where flame had once erupted, there was often only smoke. Heat was present, but it did not race. Ammunition did not detonate in sequence. The violent flash that crews expected had learned to fear failed to arrive. Seconds passed, then more. Time, long absent, returned. Escape became possible again. Hatches could be opened, commands could be shouted, men climbed out instead of vanishing. Some tanks were abandoned, some disabled, some later recovered, but the crew lived. For the first time in months, survival did not feel like an accident. Survivors reported the difference immediately. They did not speak in technical terms. They spoke in relief. A hit that should have killed them did not. Fire that should have followed never came. The story spread faster than official confirmations. Crews compared notes. They remembered which tanks burned and which did not. Slowly, a pattern formed. Units equipped with Wet-Stowage began showing fewer burn casualties. Knockouts still occurred, but the ratio shifted. Penetration was no longer a death sentence. The tank could fail without betraying the men inside it. Confidence returned cautiously, not as bravado, but as steadiness. Crews fought knowing they might live through a hit. That knowledge altered everything: the way they advanced, the way they held positions, the way they stayed in the fight instead of preemptively retreating from danger. Command took notice, though quietly. The change did not announce itself with victories or captured ground. It revealed itself in absence, in fewer burned hulls, fewer empty bunks, fewer replacements arriving to fill seats left vacant by fire. The Wet-Stowage Sherman did not dominate the battlefield. It did not outgun the enemy or render anti-tank weapons obsolete. What it did was more subtle and more important. It broke the automatic link between being hit and being killed. The evidence was no longer theoretical. It was rolling back from the front on tracks and wheels, carrying crews who should not have survived. Now, the data had faces, and the war, at last, was listening. The numbers arrived quietly, stripped of drama, impossible to argue with. Burn rates dropped first, modestly, then decisively. Tanks were still being penetrated, still being knocked out, still being lost. But the fires that once followed as a matter of course were no longer inevitable. The most feared outcome of a hit had begun to recede. Penetration no longer equaled death. This was the realization that reshaped everything. A shell could breach armor and still leave a crew alive inside the hull, disoriented but breathing. That distinction, once unthinkable, became measurable. The tank could fail mechanically without failing morally. Crew survival increased in ways that could be plotted, compared, and verified. Reports showed fewer burn casualties per engagement. Medical units treated more concussions and shrapnel wounds and fewer catastrophic burns. Replacement rates slowed. Experience accumulated instead of being erased. The battlefield began retaining its veterans. Confidence returned, but cautiously. Tankers did not suddenly feel invincible. They knew the enemy was still lethal. What changed was certainty. Death was no longer automatic. That shift mattered more than any improvement in armor thickness. It altered how crews moved, how long they stayed engaged, and how much initiative they exercised under fire. Command could no longer ignore the statistics. What had once been dismissed as anecdote now arrived as consistent data from multiple theaters. Comparisons between units equipped with Wet-Stowage and those without revealed a stark divide. The evidence did not accuse. It simply presented reality. Decisions followed, not with speeches, but with paperwork. Wet-Stowage was approved as standard for new production. Priority lists were revised. Factories adjusted. Retrofits were considered where possible. The change did not arrive all at once, but it moved forward with momentum that resistance could no longer halt. Doctrine shifted without ceremony. Manuals were updated, training adapted subtly. There was no proclamation announcing a philosophical reversal, only quiet acceptance that survivability was not a luxury, but a requirement. The tank's role expanded beyond delivering firepower. It became a vessel expected to return its crew alive. This shift carried deeper implications. It challenged the assumption that numbers alone won wars. It demonstrated that small internal changes could outperform dramatic external ones. It proved that data, when allowed to speak honestly, could overcome pride and inertia. The Sherman did not become legendary because of Wet-Stowage. Its reputation had already been written in steel and sacrifice. But this change altered how it was remembered by those who fought inside it. It was no longer just a machine that carried men into danger. It became one that gave them a chance to come back. By the time the war neared its end, the lesson was clear. Survivability multiplied effectiveness. Crews who lived learned faster, fought smarter, and endured longer. What had begun as an engineering adjustment had matured into strategic advantage. And yet, for all its impact, the change remained largely invisible to the public. No parades celebrated lower burn rates. No headlines praised water-jacketed bins. The victory was quieter than that. But in the absence of flame, in the survival of men who should have died, belief had been rewritten. And the consequences of that rewrite would extend far beyond the war that forced it. Survival changes how men fight. Not suddenly, and not dramatically, but in ways that accumulate with every engagement. As Wet-Stowage Shermans became more common, crews discovered something unfamiliar on the battlefield. Time. Time to think after being hit. Time to react instead of flee. Time to remain inside the fight, rather than assume it was already over. Crews began to fight longer under fire, where earlier hits often triggered immediate abandonment sometimes, even before flames appeared. Tankers now stayed at their stations. They assessed damage. They returned fire. They maneuvered out of danger instead of surrendering the ground by reflex. A tank that did not instantly become a coffin could still influence the battle. Panic decreased, not because fear vanished, but because it lost its certainty. Crews still feared penetration, but they no longer assumed it meant death. That distinction mattered. Panic thrives on inevitability. When outcomes became uncertain, discipline regained its place. Voices steadied. Orders were followed longer. The interior of the tank became a workspace again, not a countdown. Decision-making improved accordingly. Commanders weighed options instead of reacting blindly. Gunners adjusted fire rather than rushing shots. Drivers maneuvered with intent rather than instinct. The presence of survivability restored cognition under stress, an advantage rarely captured in equipment tables, but decisive in combat. Risk itself was redefined. It became calculated rather than desperate. Crews accepted exposure when it served a purpose, knowing they might survive the consequence. They advanced to support infantry. They held positions a few moments longer. They coordinated instead of scattering. These were not heroic gestures. They were rational ones, enabled by the belief that survival was possible. Training, long misaligned with reality, finally began to make sense. Drills that assumed post-penetration, action, communication, evacuation, recovery were no longer academic. Crews practiced what they now believed they might actually do. The gap between classroom and battlefield narrowed. Procedures gained meaning. Experience began to accumulate instead of vanishing. Veteran crews survived engagements that would once have erased them. Lessons learned in one fight carried into the next. Units developed internal knowledge, how enemy gunners aimed, where terrain favored survival, when to press and when to withdraw. This continuity multiplied effectiveness far beyond what any single technical improvement could provide. The impact spread outward. Platoons with experienced crews coordinated better. Companies held cohesion under pressure. Commanders trusted subordinates who had proven they could survive and adapt. The armored force matured not through replacement, but through retention. Survivability became a force multiplier. None of this appeared in dramatic dispatches. There were no sudden breakthroughs attributed to Wet-Stowage. No enemy line collapsed because ammunition was stored in water. The change expressed itself subtly in steadier advances, fewer catastrophic losses, and units that retained their identity over time. This was the quiet power of survivability. It did not win battles by itself. It allowed the same men to fight the next one. It preserved judgment, memory, and skill in an environment designed to destroy them. War rewards learning, but only if learners live long enough to apply it. Wet-Stowage gave crews that chance. And as they learned, adapted, and endured, the Sherman became something it had not fully been before. Not safer, but wiser. And that wisdom, earned under fire, would shape how armies thought about protection long after the last shots were fired. The delay was not born of ignorance. It was born of inertia. Large institutions do not move at the speed of danger. They move at the speed of certainty. By the time the Sherman entered combat in large numbers, its design had already been validated by doctrine, production success, and early battlefield results. Changing it meant questioning decisions that had already been declared correct. Early success masked deeper flaws. In North Africa, and during initial engagements in Europe, the Sherman performed well enough to reinforce existing beliefs. It was reliable, it was mobile. It arrived in numbers that overwhelmed opponents who lacked fuel, spare parts, or air cover. These victories mattered, but they also delayed introspection. A system that appears to work is rarely examined closely. Losses, when they came, were gradually normalized. Burned tanks became familiar sights. Casualty figures blended into the expected cost of mechanized warfare. Fire was treated as an unfortunate but unavoidable outcome, rather than a design failure demanding immediate correction. When death becomes routine, urgency fades. Designers were also distant from consequences. Engineers worked in offices and factories far from the smell of burned steel and flesh. They read reports rather than testimonies. They evaluated performance, not panic. This distance was not callousness, it was structural. The system separated decision-makers from the price paid by those decisions. War, however, is an unforgiving teacher. It accelerates learning brutally, compressing decades of peacetime refinement into months of violent trial. Every engagement tested assumptions. Every burned-out hull challenged prior logic. Eventually, patterns grew too stark to ignore. Reality forced its way into spreadsheets and meetings. Innovation, when it came, did not arise from foresight. It arose from death. Wet-Stowage was not a visionary leap ahead of its time. It was a reaction to accumulated loss. The question was not how to improve the tank, but how to stop killing the men inside it. Only when that question became unavoidable did the answer gain momentum. By then, the price had already been paid. Thousands of crews had faced fire without protection that could have saved them. Experience that might have shaped later battles had been erased instead. The war did not wait for solutions. It charged full speed ahead, collecting its costs as it went. This pattern was not unique to the Sherman. It echoed across armies and conflicts. Institutions adapt only when evidence becomes overwhelming, and evidence in war is measured in casualties. The lesson was painful but consistent. Survivability is rarely prioritized until its absence becomes undeniable. Wet-Stowage arrived late not because it was difficult, but because it challenged comfortable beliefs. It forced acknowledgement that production speed had outpaced human protection, that efficiency had been valued over endurance, and that lives had been risked unnecessarily. When the change finally took hold, It did so quietly, without apology. There were no formal reckonings, no admissions of error. The system simply adjusted and moved on. War demanded nothing less. But for those who had already burned, the timing did not matter. The solution existed, but it came after their final engagement. That truth lingered, unspoken, in the shadow of every improved tank rolling forward. And as the war continued, it carried a lesson that would not be fully understood until much later. Progress often arrives only after the cost has already been paid in full. For those who fought inside the Sherman, memory did not linger on the sound of impact. It lingered on what followed, or did not. Crews remembered fire more vividly than armor penetration. The violence of the hit was brief. The fire was intimate. It filled lungs, erased exits, and left no room for thought. Long after battles ended, it was flame, not steel, that returned in quiet moments. Survivors of wet-stowage tanks described something unfamiliar after being hit: silence. The expected roar of ignition never came. There was smoke, confusion, the ringing in the ears, but no inferno. In that pause, men realized they were still alive. That realization often arrived before understanding. They spoke of it later as disbelief more than relief. Medics noticed the change before statisticians did. Aid stations treated fewer catastrophic burns. Wounds were still severe: shrapnel, concussions, broken limbs, but men arrived breathing, conscious, recoverable. Burn wards that had once filled steadily saw fewer new faces from armored units. The absence itself became evidence. Replacement crews inherited better odds without fully understanding why. New tankers climbed into Shermans that no longer carried the same quiet sentence within them. Their chances of survival were higher, not because they were better trained or luckier, but because a decision had been made far from the front. Protection had been added invisibly. Morale stabilized without announcement. There were no speeches celebrating wet-stowage. Confidence returned not as excitement, but as steadiness. Crews slept a little easier. They advanced without the same weight of expectation. The tank ceased to feel like a gamble with fixed odds. Trust in the machine returned slowly. Not trust that it would stop every shell, but trust that it would not betray them the moment it was hit. This distinction mattered deeply. A tank did not need to be invulnerable. It needed to be honest. Wet-stowage restored that honesty. Thousands lived who would not have. They returned to units. They went home after the war. They carried scars instead of names on memorials. Their survival did not alter headlines or strategy maps. It altered families. This was the human consequence no report could fully capture. Survivability did not just preserve manpower, it preserved continuity, memory, and the quiet belief that improvement was possible even in war. It meant fewer last letters, fewer empty bunks, fewer names spoken only in the past tense. The Sherman's reputation would always be complex. It was never the most heavily armored or the most feared. But in its final form, it learned something essential. War does not only test machines, it tests whether systems are willing to protect the people who trust them. Wet-stowage did not make the tank heroic. It made survival more likely. And in a war measured by loss, that was enough. The impact was human, intimate, and mostly unseen. But its echoes would shape how armies thought about protection long after the last burned hull cooled. Because once survival becomes possible, it becomes expected. Wet-stowage did not win battles in the way dramatic weapons are remembered. It did not announce itself with breakthroughs or collapses. What it proved instead was quieter and more enduring. That small internal changes can save more lives than any visible increase in firepower. Survival, it turned out, was not a byproduct of victory. It was a prerequisite for it. The lesson was strategic. Armies fight with people, not machines alone. A tank that preserves its crew, preserves experience, judgment, and cohesion. Wet-stowage demonstrated that survivability multiplies effectiveness over time. A crew that lives, learns. A crew that learns, adapts. A crew that adapts lasts longer than one replaced after every engagement. It also forced a reconsideration of engineering culture. The Sherman's evolution showed that humility matters as much as innovation. Designers had to accept that their assumptions were incomplete, that battlefield reality could invalidate elegant theory. Wet-Stowage was not an admission of failure, it was proof of learning. But learning required listening, and listening required setting pride aside. Data, not confidence, drove that shift. Once the numbers became undeniable, belief changed. Burn rates, casualty ratios, and survival times did what argument could not. They overrode tradition and habit. The episode became a reminder that, in war, pride is expensive, and that evidence ignored always returns with interest. War punishes slow learners. It does not care how reasonable a design once seemed or how efficient a system appears on paper. It tests relentlessly, exposing weaknesses without mercy. Wet-Stowage arrived because the war demanded it, not because institutions anticipated it. That distinction lingered as a warning for the future. Perhaps the most enduring lesson was this: protection is more than armor thickness. Steel can stop a shell, but it cannot guarantee survival after failure. True protection accounts for what happens when defenses are breached. Fire suppression, ammunition isolation, internal layout, these details proved as decisive as any external plate. Modern armored design absorbed this lesson deeply. Post-war tanks increasingly treated crew survivability as central rather than incidental. Ammunition was isolated, blow-off panels introduced, fire suppression systems automated. These choices traced a lineage back to the Sherman's quiet evolution. Wet-Stowage did not end with the war. It became a philosophy. In hindsight, the change seems obvious, but it was not obvious to those living before the evidence existed. That is the uncomfortable truth Wet-Stowage revealed. Progress in war is rarely elegant. It is reactive, purchased with loss, and refined under pressure. The challenge is not inventing solutions, it is recognizing when they are needed. Wet-Stowage proved that saving lives does not always require revolution. Sometimes it requires restraint, an acceptance that the enemy will still hit you, that armor will still fail, and that survival depends on what happens next. It replaced denial with preparation. The Sherman never became invincible. That was never the point. What it became, at last, was honest about its limits and responsible for the men inside it. That realization reshaped armored warfare far beyond Normandy's hedgerows. It reframed how armies thought about protection, responsibility, and the true cost of delay. And it set the stage for one final truth, one that would never appear in specifications or victory parades, but would echo quietly through every tank designed afterward. Wet-Stowage never appeared in victory parades. No crowds gathered to applaud water-jacketed ammunition racks. No headlines praised antifreeze mixtures or internal compartment layouts. The change arrived without ceremony because it was never meant to be seen. Its success was measured in absence in fires that did not start, in screams that were never heard. It had no sound and no spectacle. No recoil, no muzzle flash, no thunderous demonstration of power. Wet-Stowage did not announce itself on the battlefield. It worked quietly, passively, doing nothing at all unless everything had already gone wrong. Only then did it matter. When it did, it simply prevented fire. That simplicity was its strength. Where flames had once raced unchecked, they now stalled or failed altogether. Where seconds had once been all a crew possessed, minutes sometimes appeared. Hatches opened. Commands were spoken. Men climbed out under their own power. The tank might be lost, but the crew was not. Fear did not disappear. War does not allow that. But fear lost its certainty. The automatic expectation of death after a hit faded. Crews still braced for impact, still respected enemy guns, still understood the risks. What changed was the finality. Survival was no longer an exception. It was a possibility. That possibility altered everything, even when it went unspoken. Men fought knowing they might live through failure. That knowledge steadied hands and sharpened judgment. It preserved experience. It allowed learning to continue instead of being erased. It gave the armored force continuity in a war designed to consume it. Wet-Stowage did not make the Sherman invincible. It did not stop shells. It did not guarantee victory. It accepted reality instead of denying it. Armor would be penetrated. Tanks would be hit. The question was never whether failure would occur, but what followed after it did. For too long, the answer had been fire. Wet-Stowage changed that answer. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to save thousands of men whose names never appeared in design meetings or production schedules. Enough to turn a machine from a liability into a responsibility fulfilled. The upgrade arrived late, too late for many. That truth cannot be softened. But it arrived in time for others, and in war, that distinction matters. Progress is often measured not by what it fixes, but by what it prevents from happening again. After the war, the lesson endured. Tanks grew heavier, guns more powerful, threats more complex. But inside, survivability became non-negotiable. Ammunition, isolation, fire, suppression, escape routes. These ideas trace their lineage back to a simple decision made under pressure. Drown the flames before they could take hold. No monument marks that decision. No medal was struck for it. Its legacy lives instead in the men who walked away from wrecked vehicles, alive enough to remember what almost happened. They didn't make the Sherman invincible. They made it survivable. And in a war defined by loss, that quiet upgrade saved everything that still mattered.